Hi everyone, and welcome to a very special video for the annual 2020. So the annual is always a really special chance for us to look back on a year and a year of behavioural science. And I'm here today with my colleagues Mike Hughes and Rory Sutherland. So as we know, 2020 was a crazy year. Rory, what kind of stood out for you as things we learned from behavioural science over the course of the year?
One thing, obviously, okay, I'm going to mention the pandemic and then we'll just pass on. But I mean, the extent to which actually suddenly during a pandemic, every question becomes a behavioral question, because I suddenly realized to a huge extent, most businesses and organizations and governments actually predict future behavior by looking at past behavior and extrapolating in a straight line. And of course, suddenly you can't do that anymore because optimizing on the past is no longer safe. And it's a really, really dangerous thing to do. And so suddenly more and more questions become, what the hell are people going to do, rather than making the assumption that they're going to do a kind of slightly extended version of what they did last time. The other thing which, looking at the annual, really, really makes me insanely and derangedly happy, and I only realized this last night, I've only really, being honest and being self-critical, as is the Ogilvy way, I've only really made one useful discovery in my whole life, which is that the kind of mix of talents and disciplines resident within an ad agency, which is a mixture of creativity, psychological insight, and testing and measurement, that mix of talents is of value to a far, far wider business and institutional audience than we've ever actually realized. We've spent effectively, the last 30 or 40 years behaving as though we were still paid on commission. If they've got a big communications budget, let's go and talk to them. And when I look at the mix of clients in this annual, which is everything from, campaigning against food waste to helping the Thames Valley Police to reducing factory accidents, what makes me really, really feel vindicated and happy is that these are all in categories of business which would never have spoken to an ad agency, or the kind of people you find in an ad agency and the mix of talents you find within an agency. 5 years ago, the conversation simply wouldn't have happened. And so the fact that you can use, as I say, behavioral science expands the solution space, creativity helps you explore it, and measurement and testing helps you decide where it's worth going to and whether it's worth returning, and then rinse and repeat. Okay. Now, those three things in combination have always been magical, but they've always been confined to promoting packaged goods brands for businesses that were created somewhere between New York and Chicago, somewhere in the late 19th or early 20th century, broadly speaking. And the ability to take exactly the same valuable combination and find completely new valuable markets for making this approach to thinking work has just made me ecstatically happy.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think one of the projects that really stands out for me that we mentioned in the annual is right at the start of the pandemic, as just we were getting into COVID, was our work with NHS Nightingale. And I think we'll all remember on the team here where we had to work really fast at speed to try and think of some behaviourally informed ideas to help the NHS staff and the volunteers stay hydrated, motivated, and also kind of mentally healthy during their 12-hour shifts working in the Nightingale Hospital. And I think that was a great example of how we used our behavioural ideas, but also a sense of creativity to kind of bring them to life at a fast speed.
It's a beautiful example, that colour of your pea thing, which I can subjectively say clearly worked quite well because I've used it personally for a year after the work was produced. I've suddenly been much more alert to Barocca, by the way, does throw off the experiment badly. I ought to just make that point. So if you've been taking, but Barocca is bizarre. It's great if you can have a power cut, isn't it? Because you can just take some Barocca, wee in a jar, and then light your home with an eerie yellow glow for the next few hours. But as long as you stay off the Barocca, that P test is a brilliant example of making salient what's important. Because you have human intelligence and you have importance, human attention, sorry. You have human attention and you have importance. And quite often, just by the course of things through context, we're not paying attention to what's important, because the salient things aren't important and the important things aren't salient. And those little interventions, that also applies to the factory safety work for Kimberly Clark, by the way. That it's making salient at the moment when it matters what's really important to you is just a really important approach to design, I think, which is too often overlooked.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. I think this idea of salience actually was brought out in some of the work you ran, Mike, with Christian Aid, and how to kind of transform their Christian Aid week to make it a virtual event and actually make these things stand out for people as well as being fun.
Yeah, because interestingly, again, it was, I think, a few briefs in the annual this year where things have changed. We now have to completely reimagine the context with which we deliver, and also the behaviors that we want to change in a small space of time. And Christian Aid was another one of those examples where suddenly the community of volunteers that go out on the streets every year just couldn't happen anymore. So they had to go into virtual settings, and probably speaking to some audiences who were kind of less au fait with new technology and Zoom, although we all were perhaps at the start of the pandemic. And we found some really lovely insights that actually this was, if we want to get people to do new behaviors, you don't need to change those behaviors. You just need to reframe what you are asking people to do. So one of the challenges was, how do you create a virtual quiz? People might not have done it before. Just telling people that you're inviting family and friends into your front room, suddenly it becomes a behavior which everyone can do.
Yeah, I think my favourite line from that was also saving lives from your sofa. So it changes from just giving money online to actually, I'm making a personal difference here from the comfort of my own home.
It is a wonderful lesson, isn't it? Which a lot of good behavioral economists have pointed out repeatedly, that norms and habits are the big gravitational force of behavior. Because, the interesting thing, why didn't we use Zoom for things like that beforehand? When you think about it, the technology was there 2 or 3 years beforehand at an equivalent level of development. And the simple reason was the norm was you met physically. And any deviation from that made you weird. If you suggested, actually, I won't fly to Frankfurt, I'll just chat to Jürgen virtually. That went from, as I said, it went from being Dr. Pepper to being Coke in the space of, a few weeks. Now, the interesting question is whether that'll stick. And I think to an extent it will. I think to a large extent it will. There's also the really interesting question, by the way, I'm getting a bit, red herringy here, but bear with me, that quite a lot of the networks we formed during this year, meetings, for example, where there's a guy in Sydney and there's someone in Bozeman, Montana, and there's someone in London, okay, those kind of networks don't really map onto the hub and spoke air travel networks very well, do they? So the idea that you can revert simply to physical travel when you've suddenly created these networks which are geographically vastly more disparate and where everybody isn't resident in a megacity, I think those things are going to endure, actually. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, I think we found that in some of the work that we've done over the past 9 months as well, that actually some of these insights that we found in this rapid change of behavior, I don't think we're just going to forget those insights overnight. I think what new behaviors do quite quickly is give you a lot of insights that might have been there already that you can now just apply to different areas.
And also the idea of sticky behaviors, I suppose, because quite a lot of advertising is a kind of repetitive game in that you're continually trying to maintain salience and therefore increasing your share of the typical repertoire buyer's wallet. Okay. And then behaviors like one bin is rubbish. What's glorious about that is once it works forever. Okay. Once you've got 2 bins, to be honest, I mean, this was the kind of insight I always remember us talking about. If you put George Monbiot or Greta in a house with only 1 bin, after about 3 weeks, they both be going, oh, sod it. Chucking it right. You could put Clarkson in a house with 3 bins and he'd probably separate out his rubbish.
Yeah.
So understanding the importance of those kind of interventions which are sticky. In other words, once you go there, you never go back. And we need a better way of actually evaluating those, because that campaign was provenly highly effective at getting Londoners to get extra bins in I think hundreds of thousands, if I'm right in the numbers.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, actually, the lifetime effect of that is really, really huge.
Absolutely. And I think the work the team did in Paris with trying to reduce kind of public urination was also
and public urination in France too. So that's just to make clear that this is no easy challenge.
Yeah, exactly. I think that just shows the kind of power of this creative approach and doing something you wouldn't really expect, painting things on the street, painting beautiful designs in places you don't want people to kind of mess up.
And there's the beautiful trompe l'oeil of turning a corner, painting a corner so it doesn't look like a corner. So the default instinct to pee in a corner is disrupted. It's fabulous.
Yeah, it's great, absolutely great. And I think another favourite of my projects in the annual is the work with the vulnerable PPE. So I think when the work was started, we probably didn't relate to PPE in the same way as we do now, because it was way before the pandemic. But we use the idea of vulnerability and helping people to feel more vulnerable whilst wearing their PPE as a way for them to actually practice safer behaviours.
So talk us through that a little bit more, just for the people who aren't big readers, because I think it's a really important idea.
Absolutely. So this is leveraging an insight from boxing, actually, and the finding that when boxers are actually wearing helmets and kind of headgear, they behave more violently and more dangerously. So they decided to help boxers kind of perform a bit more safer by removing their headgear. So we use the same kind of insights for a factory, and where they were using really sharp machinery. And whilst we couldn't remove the PPE exactly, we created some new forms of gloves and helmets where you could almost see people's skeletons through them, or they had the designs of kind of brains on the caps. So you really kind of felt a bit closer to your body, really. And if you were chopping something, you could see just how close your kind of bones would be to the gloves, helping people to feel more vulnerable whilst actually still staying protected.
That's, again, a classic case of saliency, isn't it? Because it counterbalances that kind of offsetting effect. I mean, it was most famously, the example was wearing seat belts makes you drive slightly more dangerously. So it's that kind of natural, equal and opposite psychological reaction to a lot of safety equipment. And I think those kind of things are so important in terms of just design, because it's design in terms of where attention lies, what you're conscious of at the time you're doing something.
Yeah, I think it justifies why you would need a creative psychological insights agency to solve these problems as well. I think that's one of the aims of the annual, is that actually just to normalize coming to the psychologists to try and solve some of these challenges. For instance, the posters in Nightingales we talked earlier, they might not have been designed by psychologists in the past. It would have just been a case of, we need to tell people what we want them to know, and hopefully they'll do the thing we want them to do. Whereas I think the annual helps normalize the key psychological insights and then creativity, which overcomes the challenge.
Do you remember that conversation with the Thames Valley Police about the notices put in vans that say no tools kept in vans overnight, to prevent essentially what is pointless, speculative car crime or vehicle crime? And we said, well, actually, it might be more fun if you varied them and you reversed it. So you said, overnight, this van contains, a 3-day-old newspaper, 2 empty fag packets, a small bag of screws, but no tools, right? And make it a bit funny, okay? And you'll probably connect better. I mean, it would be difficult to test, not impossible, but difficult to test. And I remember them saying, in a police setting, you could never recommend that. And actually, permission for humor or permission for obliquity, in other words, solving a problem not in a way that shows you're trying to solve the problem. There's always an instinct, I think, in institutional decision making, which is, and particularly in politics, actually, which is I don't really want to solve the problem. I want to show that I care about the problem. And that urge to signal that you're trying to tackle the problem causes you to tackle the problem directly rather than obliquely.
Or rationally.
And rationally, because people go, yeah, I can see you care because you've adopted an entirely rational response to this problem. Now, the actual solution of the problem may actually require you to do something which is, you know, humorous, oblique, non-logical, non-conventionally logical. And permission to do that, I think, is really, really important, because getting people into, and it also has huge implications for measurement. Because, of course, what looks like you're trying and what works aren't necessarily the same things.
Yeah, which is why it's important that we, as much as possible, we show the results as well and the effectiveness, because it helps people in some corporations, companies, government, public policy, where it might be harder to try and test different ways of trying to address a problem. It helps them to say, but this has worked elsewhere.
Yeah, totally right. And also it prevents people, I mean, I think we've always got to be alert to this, that there's a level of unpopularity in psychological solutions, which is that the very virtue, which is they expand the possible solution space, also creates more ambiguity. And a lot of institutional decision makers love things like economics, because the very narrowness of what they consider produces an unambiguous recommendation, which, if you want to keep your job and look rational, is exactly what you want, right? The product wasn't selling, so we dropped the price. And you don't want someone like me coming in saying, have you thought of making it purple? Right? Because that's adding a degree now of complexity, ambiguity, and subjectivity to your decision-making process, which might actually require you to make a decision that you have to justify. Okay, so we've always got to be alert to this problem we face, I think. And, you know, two of the things I was weirdly proud of this year, and share your own, by the way. My two ones were, one, if you want to wear a mask without feeling weird, wear a hat. Okay. And it was a totally accidental discovery. I suddenly went, hold on, I'm walking around here and I'm actually feeling quite cool as a masked man. I'm not feeling like some slightly cowardly middle-aged bloke. I'm feeling like Zorro, right? And it was because I put a hat on with my mask. You know, those are the kind of things which actually are weirdly useful, but you'll never come up with them through any conventional rational linear process. And this is the other discovery I made this year, that out there, right, there are far more great ideas that you can post-rationalize than there are great ideas you can pre-rationalize. And therefore, if you demand complete, rigorous kind of economic rationality to arrive at a solution, you will only ever get to a tiny subdivision of the possible ideas out there.
Well, I think the last two things to mention are, so obviously have a look at the annual, check it out, it'll be available now.
Have we told them the date of Nudgestock yet?
I'm not sure we have.
No, I think it's on June the 11th, isn't it? It's going to be kind of GMT-ish. It's going to start at about 9:10-ish and go on, and it's going to be over YouTube. And you can go to nudgestock.co.uk, I think, and you'll be able to add it to your calendar shortly.
Exactly. Thank you both so much, Mike and Rory. Enjoy the annual, everyone.
Enjoy. Thanks ever so much.